Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, your guide to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Welcome back to part 2 of Determine Budget. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner, and in part 1 you already saw the overview and inputs. We are now moving on to the tools and techniques, the outputs, and a review. And we also have some exam sample questions for you at the end. There are 5 tools and techniques for us to review. They are cost aggregation, reserve analysis, expert judgment, historical relationships, and funding limit reconciliation. But let's do something else first. Let us first take a step back and take a look at the term control account. Understanding what a control account is necessary for you to understand some of the tools and techniques and outputs which we'll be looking at in just a bit. So first, let's take a look at the definition of control account from the PMBOK guide. It is a management control point where scope, budget, actual cost and schedule are integrated and compared to earned value for performance management. Okay, so much for the PMBOK guide definition. Now, when you take a look at your work breakdown structure, you or others may ask some very basic questions about the cost of the work that is to be performed. For example, you as the project manager, you may be interested to know in detail what will each and every work package cost. How about senior management? They probably want to have some aggregated numbers, right? They're not really interested in all the nitty-gritty little detail. But if you aggregate, you need to define levels of aggregation. What and where and how do you aggregate? How many levels of aggregation are required? This is where the control account comes into play. Place control accounts at relevant aggregated cost points within your work breakdown structure. In other words, you or your management will look at the work breakdown structure and point somewhere into the work breakdown structure and go, this is where I would like to have an aggregated cost reporting point, and this is where I'd like another, and that's where I'd like another, and that's where your control account will be. You then can have a way of tracking scope, budget, cost, and schedule to manage project performance at these particular points. And all of this gives you the necessary background to understand the first of our tools and techniques for Determine Budget, namely cost aggregation and how it uses control accounts. Let's take a look at the formal definition of cost aggregation from the PMBOK guide. It is summing the lower level cost estimates associated with the various work packages for a given level within the project's WBS for a given cost control account. So, what does this really mean? Let us walk through a simple example of cost aggregation, and we're using this WBS here. What you need to do in the first step is you need to add up related cost elements at the lowest level. And as you can see there on the right hand side, we have 2 related cost items, 350, and of course they add up to a total of 350. At this point, we've already demonstrated what cost aggregation at this level means. You just add it up to the next higher level. This may be sufficient if all you need is a cost aggregation at this level. However, to cover the entire project, of course, you have to work your way up to the top of the work breakdown structure. So you move on, you consider the next level up, and you add up the related costs there. This results in a total cost aggregation at the next higher level. In this example, you see that there are costs that are apart from the 350 that we just added up, and there are some that are closely related and others which are there on the left-hand side that are not so closely related, more like distant cousins of these. And you can see that the costs related to the left branch from level 2 of the work breakdown structure, that would add up to 10 plus 20 plus 30, obviously 60. The aggregated costs on the right branch at this level that we just looked at equals 200 plus 350. That will add up to 550. And you repeat this process until you reach the highest point in your project. So if we move on with this here, we have 60 on level 3 on the left and 550, and we add this up. Of course, we reach a total at the very top, level 4 is 610. You have now reached the top of your hierarchy, and this grand total represents your budget. If this diagram were expressed in terms of thousands of dollars, this means that through cost aggregation you have a budget of $610,000. Think of your household budget. You probably have some kind of a rainy day or emergency fund, something stashed away just in case something goes wrong, right? Well, it's similar on a project. However, good project management practices tells you have to do the exercise of reserve analysis more formally than most household budgets would do this, because you really want to be prepared. So let's take a look at what you need to do in reserve analysis. You need to consider both contingency and management reserves. When you look at the reserve, you need to determine how much you need and when you may need it. For instance, are there any particularly high risks in your industry that warrant a very high management contingency reserve during the month of June? The project manager then needs to work with management and ensure that this reserve will be available to the project should it be required in June. There are many ways to analyze and determine reserve requirements. For example, you can conduct an analysis of contingency reserve requirements at different levels. You can do it for a specific activity, a set of activities, or project-wide. You can opt to set aside a fixed amount or a percentage of total estimated costs to serve as your contingency reserve. Let me ask you a simple question. Who should help determine the budget? To come up with the answer, let's review a few similar questions that we asked in other lessons. In project time management, I asked, who should define the activities needed to deliver a work package? And the answer was that the people with the experience should. Also in project time management, I asked, who should estimate the duration of activities? The answer again was that people with the experience should. So, now, when I ask who should help determine the budget, the answer is, of course, the experts should. So if you look at the determine budget process from this point of view, it will come as no surprise to you that we have to use the expert judgment that is available to us. Expert judgment can come from any sources. Based on your project requirements, you should seek expert judgment when it makes sense. Let's take a look at different sources of expert judgment and why their knowledge, experience, and opinions impact the determine budget process. We may ask other project managers in our organization to help because they may have worked on similar projects on which they determined and created a budget. We may rely on consultants because consultants work on many projects in the industry and bring a lot of budgeting experience with them. We should also include our stakeholders because they may have worked on other projects where they had to create budgets. They may also be aware of unwritten rules and regulations. And note that you should not to forget to consider your customers as a stakeholder as well. After all, they may have significant influence over matters relating to budgeting. Or we may opt to reach out to other professionals. They may have technical, specialized, or subject matter expertise that can be utilized on our project. As the name implies, using historical relationships to determine a budget means simply that you use and rely on the data and characteristics from past projects in order to figure out how you create a budget for your current project. You see this in the case of parametric estimates and analogous estimates. The use of historical relationships can be simple or complex. Estimates may require only straightforward calculations, but you may also have to use a hybrid approach, like using a different technique for some segments of the project versus another one, or utilize different adjustment factors for different parts of the cost model. The cost and reliability of using historical relationships as a basis for your estimates, they vary widely. Therefore, they influence how much you should budget for a project. Some factors include similarity. We already discussed how a similar project in the past versus the present project affects reliability. The more similar, the more recent the historical project is, the more likely you are to get a good estimate and a good budget without having to do much by the way of tweaking and adjusting your model. You are also relying on the accuracy of the historical information. Did you get the historical information from a reliable source? Was that based on a single or a multiple data point? Then there is the scalability of work. In many cases, the relationships of costs may not be straightforward. For example, doubling the work output does not always mean cost estimates also double. Costs may go up with greater coordination costs among resources, or perhaps costs may go down with economies of scale. And then the parameters on the model. Some parameters, for example, expertise of your resources on your project, well, they may not be easy to quantify. Let's move on to the next tool and technique, funding limit reconciliation. According to the PMBOK guide, this is the process of comparing the planned expenditure of project funds against any limits on the commitment of funds for the project to identify any variances between the funding limits and the planned expenditures. Let's take a closer look at funding limit reconciliation, and in particular look at the two terms that you see here in red, the funding limits and the planned expenditures. Let's do that with a fun analogy. I claim that working through your budget using funding limit reconciliation is just like the game of Tetris. You've played it. The goal of the game of Tetris is to rotate and manipulate the position of a group of square tiles as they fall down from the top of the screen. You've played it, right? You have to move the falling tiles so that they fit into the void that is left between the tiles on the bottom of the screen. And you see that in the picture in the middle there. Think of the falling tiles as your planned expenditures. These are what you know you will spend on the project. For example, I plan on having to pay for an additional 3 full-time software developers and 1 tester to complete my project. Imagine the tiles on the bottom of the screen are the funding limits and other project constraints. For example, well, I have to wait until the end of the second quarter before I can add additional cost into that because my funds are already exceeded there. That's the only funding I have available. So I have to wait until an opening opens up where my new Tetris block fits in. So basically, funding limit reconciliation means you want to ensure that you have funds available for payment or disbursement when you think you will need it. In funding limit reconciliation, just as you manipulate the falling tiles in Tetris, you will have to make adjustments for everything so that it fits together. You want to make sure that your planned expenditures fit within your funding limits. For example, if your cost management plan specified that your spending curve should be fairly even and not fluctuate greatly from month to month, then in order to work within this constraint, you may have to reschedule work to more evenly spread out the expenditures. But as a project manager, before making any change, you need to examine and address any impacts of the change. For example, you need to look at your resource calendar and check for resource availability before you can reschedule any work. We are moving on to the outputs of the determine budget process. We have the cost baseline, project funding requirements, and project document updates. Let's look at them. I mentioned in the opening of this lesson that the cost baseline is your primary output of determine budget. But what is it? Well, the PMBOK guide defines it as the approved version of the time-phased project budget, excluding any management reserves, which can be changed only through formal change control procedures and is used as a basis for comparison to actual results. Well, the question, as so often with the PMBOK definition, is what on earth does this mean? Well, time-phased means that the cost baseline will show you your budget over time. As a comparison, the project schedule shows you which activities are executed over time, and the cost baseline shows you what budget, what money you need over time. Let's put all of the building blocks of your project budget together into a single view. Looking back on the inputs of the determine budget process, we had the activity cost estimates from the estimate cost process, which are added to the contingency reserves that are specific to each activity to then come up with the work package cost estimates. These work package cost estimates, along with the contingency reserves, are combined and accumulated on different control accounts, which in turn sum up to our cost baseline. The cost baseline and management reserve, well, they will now make up your project budget. As stated in the definition that we just reviewed in the previous slide, on the cost baseline, we know that the cost baseline does not include any management reserve. The cost baseline is separate from the management reserve, but when the management reserve is used, it must be added to the cost baseline. We know that the cost baseline can only be changed through formal change control procedures. Thus, only when the change is approved can the cost baseline be updated. The block diagram we just saw was concerned with only a single dimension, namely the total amount of dollars in your budget. Let's add another dimension to this. Can you guess what dimension we're going to be adding? Well, we already said that determine budget is all about when. This means we have to consider time in all of this. The cost baseline is usually shown as an S-curve, like this red S here. And the reason why it looks like an S that is sort of leaning to the right is because it shows how costs and funding work on projects. In the beginning, you have project initiation, which is relative to the overall project, not all that expensive, so not really all that much is expended at this time. Then you will do a lot of planning and executing. You will see a spike in activity, which means costs rapidly increase, and therefore the curve will go up. As you proceed through the project, activities start to slow down, and as you get towards project closure, expenditure slows and the curve over time flattens out. Of course, depending on your project, you can have several such baselines. One for human resources, one for materials, one for internal cost, one for external cost, one for domestic cost, one for internationally occurring costs. It all depends on your project. Let us now draw a time-phased view of costs, expenditures, and project funding requirements. First, once again, we take a look at our cost baseline, which is our S-curve. It shows how much we expect the project will cost. We then consider expenditures, which may lag a bit from the time when the cost was actually incurred. The level of the S-curve at the end of the project, by the way, shows us our budget at completion. After we do a reserve analysis, we can also include the management reserve to the cost baseline, which gives us our project budget. over the duration of the project, we need to understand when funding is required. In other words, when do we need to pay the bills? This is likely to be different from when the cost was incurred and when you recognize the expense. Some services or goods may require payment in advance, while others require payment after delivery, for example, 30, 60, or 90 days after you receive the invoice. Often projects quantify funding requirements as a whole, total funding requirements, as well as on a periodic basis, quarterly or annually. These are usually incremental amounts which may not be evenly distributed over time. Graphically, these are shown as steps over the cost baseline. The cost baseline considers expenditures and expected liabilities. Funds required include the cost baseline and the management reserve. Obviously, for the exam, you're not expected to draw a graph like this one, but you should understand what cost baseline, expenditure, budget, management reserve, funding requirements, what they all mean and how they relate to each other. Let's move on to the final output here in Determine Budget, which is project document updates. And we've seen this in many other lessons. When you look more closely at the budget and examine all the inputs, it could well be the case that you see issues or corrections that are required to other documents, such as the activity cost estimates or the project schedule. These don't necessarily need to be errors, but you may find that something needs to be adjusted in order to make your budget and schedule work. For example, you rescheduled work after funding limit reconciliation. What else might need to be updated? Well, the risk register. Upon looking at the risk, if the budget includes contingency and management reserve to address specific risks, this can be noted on the risk register. Think what we include here as a list of most commonly updated documents, but it is not required that all of these documents are updated. There may be other documents which may require updates based on Determine Budget. For example, the communications plan may need to be updated if there are any specific communications around budgeting which needs to be noted there. As far as sample questions go, we have seen both simple and situational type questions about the cost baseline in the commercially available test preparation products. In one question, you are shown a diagram with an S-curve and you are asked to identify what it is. And as the answer, you will have to know that it is either an S-curve or a time-phased budget. And there may be situational type questions where a budget meeting is described, followed by the question how to best display the information graphically. And of course, again, the S-curve would be your answer. Let's review. The difference between estimate cost and determine budget is that in estimate costs, you are focusing on the how much. How much does an activity cost? In determine budget, you are focusing on the when. When will we need the money made available? Or better, we are creating a budget that tells us when we will have to have these particular funds available. Your primary output is, of course, your cost performance baseline and funding requirements for your project. You should definitely know what an S-curve is. Know that the cost baseline excludes management reserves and the project budget includes the cost baseline and management reserve. We have now reached the end of this lesson. So Justine says,
Shalom.
And I say, until next time.